Good morning, those of you who are joining the webinar. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Takes 2 to 3 minutes for all the attendees to load, so we want to give people a chance to get logged in. If you'll just sit tight, we'll get started momentarily. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a minute. Takes a couple of minutes for all the people to load into Zoom, so we just want to give some people the chance to get in, and we will get started in just a minute. Good morning from Bethesda, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. We hope you are well, and we're glad to be with you today virtually. This is our 5th webinar discussing COVID-19 and trade. We're delighted to have so many of you back with us again this week. When we started this series back in March, we didn't know how long this period of physical distancing would last. We're going to try to keep doing these sessions on Thursdays at the same time until we're able to host you again in person. Next week, we actually have 2 webinars planned. Our regular Thursday session at 11 a.m. Eastern Time next Thursday, we will look at Buy America provisions in the Defense Production Act. We're also hosting a special webinar on Tuesday at 11 a.m. with Congressman Brad Schneider of Illinois. Congressman Schneider is a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, and he's going to join us to discuss America's global leadership in the wake of COVID-19. He'll be joined by Arit Frankel of the Alliance for American Leadership. We're also planning on several more events coming in May and hope to announce additional webinars in the days to come. Want to ask you all too, if you have ideas for topics or speakers for our upcoming webinars, please let us know. We welcome your suggestions, and in fact, the idea for today's discussion and the topic next week came from emails from WITA members. For today, if you have any trouble with your connection, you can always go to WITA's YouTube stream and watch the event live there. And the panelists, after the panelists' remarks and a brief discussion, we'll try to answer audience questions. If you're watching this on Zoom, you have the ability to ask questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. With over 600 people on the webinar, we're unable to have all of you on live audio and video, but we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. We're delighted today to be joined by an amazing panel, including my co-host in this series of webinars, Wendy Cutler, the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Today, we'll also be joined by 3 fantastic guests, including my friend Nicole Bibbins-Collinson, who leads the International Trade and Government Relations practice at Sandler, Travis & Rosenberg. Hi, Nicole. The Honorable Anabel Gonzalez, the former Trade Minister of Costa Rica, and Beth Baltzan, who's held numerous positions across the U.S. government, including a USTR and counsel in both the U.S. Senate and the House Ways and Means Committee. We're delighted to host all of them today, and those of you watching on Zoom should have received an email this morning with their biographies and today's event program. Reminder, after the panelists' remarks and discussion, we'll turn to questions. With that, I'll turn it over to my co-host in this series, Wendy Cutler. Wendy?
Well, thanks, Ken, and I'm really pleased. Again, we're getting a great turnout, and we've heard a lot of positive things from the trade community, that they feel very connected to these webinars and knowing that they're going to be taking place every Thursday. But I'll also admit we have received some suggestions from others, including that maybe that our webinars have become kind of an echo chamber and that everyone's kind of saying the same things. And so we're going to do a better job trying to bring in kind of diversity of views. And I think you'll see that today when we get into discussing supply chains. But in any event, we really welcome your feedback on ideas for the program, but also on suggestions on how to make this more interesting and relevant. I just wanted to do, like I do every week, a brief update of kind of COVID-related trade events. I'll be quick, but a lot has happened this week. And when you look, again, every week in this world seems very long. So let me just highlight kind of 4 key developments, and then I will kick it off with the panelists. I'll also say I'm extremely proud that we have an all-female panel and a female moderator. So that makes me very excited about today's event as well. So what's gone on in the past week? First, with respect to tariffs, we have seen that the US has suspended some tariff payments for a couple of months on a limited number of products, mainly applying to MFN tariffs and not to tariffs that have been applied in recent years under different trade statutes. But also on the tariff front, we've seen now in the EU, Phil Hogan, throw his hat in the ring with respect to wanting to work with other countries and kind of seeking some kind of permanent liberalization of tariffs and non-tariff measures with respect to PPE, medical supplies, medical equipment. And this builds on the New Zealand-Singapore declaration, where they actually append a list of the products that they've pledged not to impose tariffs on, and are inviting other countries to sign on to that. Second, with respect to export restrictions in the medical area, I was in touch with one of our panelists from 2 previous webinars, Simon Evanet. He has shared that at least this week so far, there's only been 1 additional country, so now 76 countries have export restrictions in the medical area in place. However, he noted there are more measures in place, up to 118 this week. I would also note with respect to export restrictions, and our panelist Sabine Wayan, she had flagged this a couple of weeks ago, that the EU now is going to extend their export restriction. However, it looks like they're going to limit its scope to fewer products. And also in this regard, the United States this week has put forward more exceptions to our FEMA export restrictions in this area, including the non-application of these restrictions to exports to Canada and Mexico as a final destination. We've seen a lot of activity, third, in the food and agricultural area, particularly over the past 2 days. The G20 agriculture ministers have come together, and they have kind of underscored the need to keep the ag markets free of trade restrictions and allowing trade to flow. And this was followed by 23 WTO members yesterday, including the United States, the EU, Japan, Brazil, and others, to urge to put forward their commitment on export restrictions, maintaining open trade in this area, and really urging others to exercise restraint in any food stockpiling. And the fourth area I want to just touch upon briefly is what's going on in the investment area, because we're also seeing more investment restrictions pop up in this COVID world, kind of based on the fear that there are a lot of undervalued assets in many of these countries now, and countries are looking at wanting to prevent these assets being bought out. And so the EU and Australia a couple of weeks ago put some restrictions in, and India followed this route just this week. So those are kind of 4 kind of key developments. And with that, I'd really now plan to turn to our panelists. Today, we're going to touch upon all of these areas, but we're going to try and do a deeper dive on the whole issue of supply chains, both with respect to what's going on, what should be done, what will companies do, and what can governments do in this area. I want to start with Beth Baltzan, who's been writing a lot about this. And Beth, the way I read some of your papers is that you're suggesting kind of a different way of looking at this whole supply chain issue, and that maybe the export restrictions and the other trade restrictions aren't the problem. Maybe the problem is based more on the system that we've created. I hope that's a fair summary, but now I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of explain your thinking here. But also if you can maybe share with us how that might translate into policy recommendations. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for including me. I really appreciate it. So I'm looking at this from the perspective of the fact that we have a global shortage of equipment that's necessary to save lives. So I don't think this is sort of your garden variety trade problem. This is a different animal. So the question for me is, how do we make sure that we're never in this situation again? So that's the lens I'm bringing to bear. And I think if we're going to do that, we should take a look at what the system incentivizes. And these are rules that we've devised over the last 70 years. I think at a top line level, most of us would agree that the operating principle is if we liberalize capital flows so that they can go wherever we want, that's going to end up with the most efficient use of scarce resources. So I think that's sort of the governing principle. What's interesting is I've done a lot of historical reading in the last few years. That's actually not the system that we think of that's the system that was devised in the 40s, but in fact, it was FDR and Keynes. They didn't think that liberalization alone would produce peace and prosperity. They actually felt that unfettered capitalism posed certain risks. And if you look at the context in which they were operating, that makes sense. They were dealing with the 29 crash from a concentration of, sort of power in the hands of financiers, but they were also dealing with the problem of cartels and concentrated production. So that was true in the United States, but they also believed that it was one of the reasons that you ended up with fascism in Europe. So that was a really important issue for them. And then of course, you also had sort of the treatment of labor and the use of forced labor under the Third Reich. So all of these things informed their view, and they didn't just believe that you needed tariff cuts and liberalization. They actually thought you needed a suite of rules that would provide some constraints around what might be natural excesses of capital. And that was memorialized in the Havana Charter. So what happened with the Havana Charter? Well, the lore is that Congress, the US Congress, rejected it because the Congress was isolationist, but people like Don Johnson have done research on this. And in fact, it was the US business community. It was the chamber, it was NAM and FTC that didn't actually want these restrictions. And so they set about making sure that the Havana Charter was not ratified. So we ended up defaulting to a laissez-faire system, but that wasn't really the original vision. So you fast forward to 2001, you got the laissez-faire system, and then we introduced this giant non-market economy into the system by letting China join the WTO. I think what we really need to do is explore how those two things intersect, because you've got a laissez-faire system where capital in general is going to be focused on returns to capital, particularly after Milton Friedman in the 70s, who said you don't have other considerations. They're going to be looking in general for the least expensive place to manufacture their products. If you compare that with sort of the incentives in the state capitalist model, we know China ended up being the world's factory floor, but how did they do it? Was it really natural comparative advantage, or was it massive government intervention in things like suppressing labor rights? And as we're seeing more and more, the use of forced labor, suppression of environmental regulation, massive subsidies, currency manipulation, and then of course, retaliation for complaining about any of the foregoing, whether it's by an individual company or by a country. So I think there are real risks in the way those two systems have interacted that have produced a concentration of production in China that is not actually the result of natural comparative advantage. And I think a lot of us assume that it was. So then if we link that back to the situation with tariffs and this very understandable desire to lift tariffs on medical equipment, what happens if you do that? Well, you're actually reinforcing the existing cost structure that favors China, because producers know they can go there and then export everywhere else duty free. So that's why I have some hesitation of offering that as a solution in the long term. I mean, in the short term, I certainly understand why people are concerned about it, but it's not going to be, in my view, a long-term solution to the problem. And then I'm just going to link this back to TPP. Wendy, you mentioned Japan and some of the efforts Japan's doing, and Japan is recruiting countries to join TPP like Thailand for the purpose of diversifying supply chains away from China. Well, let's think about that. If you get rid of tariffs on an MFN basis, what incentive is there to produce in the TPP region? Principally, these agreements are supposed to be lifting the remaining tariffs, and that's the incentive to source there. If we go MFN 0, then I think that potentially negates the benefits of TPP. And then the last thing I would say on this is we've got to look at the rules of origin in TPP to make sure that they are going to drive the behavior we say we want to see, which is, that I looked at the roof for medical equipment and it's only 30%, which means that even if Japan's able to do what it wants with TPP, you're still going to have 70% of the content eligible to come from China and circulate as a TPP good duty free. So that's my view of the world. I really look forward to the conversation. In terms of policy recommendations, I think we need to probably, figure out what we consider to be critical supplies, critical manufacturing. I think we need to identify what the supply chains are. I don't think we really know that because we just sort of thought that the market would work. And I think in the short term, I actually think we should have started using the Defense Production Act in January so that we could be making this stuff and actually supplying it to other countries if we were in a position to do that and start mitigating the what I think is a somewhat natural default to put export bans on this stuff. We should just make sure we're never in the position again that countries feel like they have to do that.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Now let me move to Annabelle Gonzalez. Annabelle, you've been writing a lot in this area as well, including a very detailed paper on what the G20 specifically could do, mentioning tariffs, mentioning export restraints, but also looking at areas that we really haven't, trade-related areas that we haven't really touched about much in these webinars, including standards, IPR, movement of medical personnel. So I'd be interested in some of those areas, if you could elaborate a bit on them. And also, I'm sure you probably want to respond to a couple of the points that Beth made. So we would welcome your views on, tariff elimination in this area, short-term versus long-term. I think Beth has made that distinction. But also this notion of even getting rid of export restraints in the medical area. Is that really feasible? Is that something that you think the G20 can really move forward on, given that so many G20 countries have restrictions in place? Over to you. I think you need to lift your mute button.
I guess that's better. So I was thanking you and Ken and WITA for having me and hoping that everyone is staying safe. So let me first say a couple of words on supply chains, because I see two with separate discussions going on right now. So the first one is that supply chains are facing severe disruptions, as we know, derived from measures that have been put in place to contain the virus. So we have the disruption of the supply of parts and components, the surge in cost in air freight and commercial shipping, the drop in demand for truck and freight rail, and of course, a deep collapse of international trade flows. We just saw the WTO come out with the estimate for trade flows in 2020, saying they may decrease anywhere from 13% to 32% or even more. So in this context, firms are basically just struggling to deal with the situation, deploying stocks, looking for alternative suppliers, arranging for transportation, managing orders. And as we have seen, that the situation can be very dramatic in the case of the personal protective equipment or medical supplies more broadly, where this rapid and huge increase in demand has brought great stress to supply chains. So in this context, so I guess the question is, what is the role of trade policy in this context? And we have seen a number of governments taking measures to reduce tariffs on some of these critical products, albeit on a temporary basis, and I'll come to this. A few of them have also instituted green lanes to facilitate the import and release of goods that are critical to fight COVID-19. And some are also facilitating access to technical standards and expediting conformity assessment procedures to expedite the approval and entry to markets of some of these products. So trade policy in some cases is actually helping us fight COVID-19 and save lives. But also, and you reported on this at the beginning, Wendy, there are now 76 countries, if I understand correctly, that have instituted export restrictions, including export bans on some of this critical medical stuff. And this has contributed to exacerbating the problem. And it is clear, of course, that these measures are very detrimental to the importers, and in particular to the world's poorest. 10 exporting countries account for almost 3/4 of exports of medical goods and nearly 2/3 of world exports of protective gear. So if all of these countries were to institute export bans, well, then the rest of the world will be in big trouble. But they're also very detrimental to exporters. And this is something that I want to highlight because it's not only that importers are affected by them, but these export bans, they raise prices, they discourage investment, which is exactly what we need actually to increase supply. And they, of course, invite retaliation. So this is, as I said, very worrisome. But it's even more worrisome when we think that a number of countries are putting these restrictions in the area of foodstuffs. And you also referred to this, Wendy. So including wheat and rice. And we even see a country like Turkey that restricted exports of lemons because they serve this dual purpose. They are foodstuff, and you can also make hand sanitizer with lemons. So this, I think, is very worrisome. There's no shortage of foodstuffs. Harvests are looking good, and the potential negative impact on food security, on nutrition, on health, and even from a political perspective in terms of stability of many places, this is quite concerning. Fortunately, as you said, I thought that the commitment put out yesterday by a number of WTO countries and members, driven by, I think, by the leadership of Canada, is very positive in terms of committing themselves to open trade in foodstuffs. So this is like part of the issue of what's going on in the area of supply chains. The other discussion, I think, is more what will happen in going forward and whether supply chains will be restructured. And if so, how will they look like in a post-COVID-19 world? And I think you hear in this case calls for self-sufficiency and autarky, particularly in the area of, say, medical supplies. We are, of course, all scared with what has happened in the context of COVID-19. And the first reaction seems to be, okay, so let's bring all production home and we're going to do this from here. But this poses a number of questions. So what are we going to do? Are we going to do all the ventilators, for instance, in the US? And what happens if the next pandemic does not require ventilators, but requires dialysis machines or other types of devices? So it's not an easy question. There are also calls for increasing resiliency in supply chains through greater diversification, coupled with innovative mechanisms, for example, for stockpiling of critical products, because it has been clear that one thing that has happened in many countries is that they were not prepared from this perspective. So in my view, in going forward, supply chains will be driven by the factors that have driven global value chains so far. Availability across geographies of raw materials, of advanced manufacturing, of R&D capabilities, access to skilled workers, transport costs, etc. And one critical point here, of course, is what would be the role of trade policy in going forward, particularly in recovering from the coronavirus and rebuilding for the future. And this is where I think a collective response becomes very critical. And it's critical in several ways. One is to prepare for future pandemics. And I do think here that we need to make sure that goods can be moved from where they are produced to where they are needed. So in my view, looking at an agreement on, in the context of the WTO, for example, on reducing tariffs or eliminating tariffs on a permanent basis, I do think that that makes sense. I do think that understanding on, restricting the use of export bans is something that will become even more critical in going forward. I think we need to continue to look at this conformity assessment procedures, trying to come together, maybe with an agreement in this area, for example, in medical products. We need to look at some of these other things that you were mentioning, sort of like a framework agreement for cross-border the provision of medical services or health services more broadly, looking at some of the IPR questions, like making sure that the regimes in place do not hinder, for instance, access to vaccines, to some of these critical treatments, and others. But also in going forward, I just want to mention two things that I believe are very relevant, and I think they're related to what Beth was mentioning. One is I think that we're going to see great acceleration to the move to the digital world. And the fact that we are hosting this conference is just one more example of what's going to be, happening here. So ongoing discussions in the WTO in this area, in my view, will become extremely relevant. And second is this discussion about, state-driven economies versus market-driven economies that is gonna, again, in the context of all the massive support that is coming, in all countries, and it's, rightly so, because we know it's very important, but this is gonna pose a lot of questions in the context of what's gonna be the level playing field. So this discussion is not gonna be just a discussion, Western countries against China and others, but it's really, we're all going to have to think very clearly about this, because this state support will have increased by the time we get out of the coronavirus quite significantly in many countries, particularly in the advanced world. So let me stop here, Wendy.
Well, thank you very much. It wasn't like subsidies were an easy issue before the COVID, but I can see your point, how it's going to be more complicated to go forward with disciplines in this area. Nicole, if I can now turn to you to offer the business perspective on these supply chains. I know you have a lot of clients that have been struggling with supply chains, both in the short term, but also I'm sure they're thinking about the longer term, what this means for them. So if you can share with us some of the struggles and issues they're dealing with, and also maybe you can touch upon how they view tariff elimination in this area, but also government intervention. Is this something that your clients think the government should just stay out of, or are they resigned that the government is going to get more involved, and therefore they're looking to see how this new world could be shaped in a way that can work to their advantage as well? Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks, Ken. It's always a pleasure to speak at these events, and so I appreciate the opportunity. I'm representing today several of our clients that we've had conversations with already, discussing how is this going to impact you? What are you doing looking forward? What are you planning from a business perspective? And what's interesting is a couple of companies that we've spoken with, they have they've taken a look at what's happened, and those that we've talked to so far had their supply chains disrupted multiple times. For example, if they were producing one component in China that was then shipped to South Korea, let's say a chip, or a South Korean chip that was shipped to China, it was incorporated into a plastic cap. That plastic cap was then sent to Malaysia. In Malaysia, it was incorporated into a full medical device that was then brought into the United States. Depending on when the virus hit, each time in each of those countries, there was some sort of a pause or there was some sort of a restriction. So they weren't hit just one time with the virus. They were hit twice. So each time, it wasn't just that China shut down or South Korea shut down or that Malaysia shut down or that the United States shut down. It's that the staggered impact and how that's disrupted on a long-term basis. So it's not just for this short period of time, but depending on when each country slowly starts to come back online is going to impact when they are able to actually have goods back on the shelves again. So this is something that's they've all started looking at. And one of the things that's coming out from this is this idea of vertical sourcing. So in lieu of having multiple countries that might all focus all of your chips in one area and all of your plastic caps in another area and all of the other assembly processes in yet a third country, is to maybe do a vertical integration of that manufacturing in one or two countries, so that you have actually, you've sort of backstopped yourself by creating a vertically integrated production of line in one country. And if that one goes offline, you can then switch to additional production in your other vertically integrated country until this one comes back on. And if this goes down, vice versa. I think that's one of the most interesting aspects that I've seen from this. And one of the things whenever companies are looking at countries to do this, they try to figure out which countries have a government system that's going to allow me to do that. And one of the things that I've talked about is that I really see this virus as having a triple threat. One is the personal health threat, the second is the economic threat, but the third is the civil or social threat. And when we're talking about some of the manufacturing processes in some of the countries that are manufacturing powerhouses, you look at their governments, and some have fragile governments. They also have fragile civil societies. And so when you see a situation where the countries have been reliant on foreign direct investment, but no one is coming in because of the virus, when the countries have been reliant on tariffs on imported goods to facilitate all of their functions and provide governance to the country, and goods are not coming into the country anymore, they're losing their money, they're losing their FDI. They're not going to be able to provide the safety nets that these people need. They're not wealthy countries. Therefore, you're going to have civil distress. And I think we're seeing that in the United States. We have, if you look at some of the capital cities in our states, we have protests. We have some people who are becoming more and more agitated. Now, magnify that if you're in some of these countries who have very fragile civil societies, I think that we're going to see some of these problems. So one of the things that they've said is they're really looking at the countries and how they're managing this process, how they're trying to deal with whether they're restricting exports, whether they're allowing additional imports, whether they're putting tariffs on. How are they managing it? How are they trying to ensure that the country is going to be there and vital for putting that money in? I think that's going to be one of the determining factors. Another thing that was interesting is that there are many companies who've been moving towards a more sustainable supply chain, something that is more reflective of trying to eliminate climate change. And what I found interesting is that they've said that in some corporations, there's sort of a silo where you have the business, the transactional group who are looking at how things are being produced and getting the goods done and how much it's going to cost. And then you have the corporate social responsibility people who are looking at the environment and the workers. And those two groups are not always talking to each other. And what they've said is that these have kind of brought our two groups together. And those who were who were pushing from more of a sustainability perspective to making changes are now seeing this COVID virus as a reason and as an impetus to make those changes. So imagine, if you will, that if you've been supplying from 5 different countries and you've got ships and boats going back and forth across oceans, or you're having this large carbon footprint, now you've got an even greater reason to try to create this vertically integrated manufacturing process where you are eliminating or minimizing some of your carbon footprint. So you actually take on and have an excuse to move towards this type of an operation from a sustainability perspective, from a climate change perspective, from a potential global pandemic impact perspective. And I think it's something that we're going to see some of the companies moving towards. With respect to what the companies are saying from a government intervention perspective, I think any company is most inclined to have a government that will intervene in order to help them for investment purposes, but one that keeps the rules the same. I think when you have a situation where you have countries who may do knee-jerk reactions and suddenly take actions on one day your imports are allowed, the next day they're not, one day your exports are allowed, the next day they're not, those type of quick actions taken by different government entities are just frustrating to to companies, because they want predictability. They want to know what they can do, when they can do it, and how they can do it. So it's sort of a push me, pull you. They want to have some intervention, but they want to make sure that once we're in, you leave us alone and let the companies try to manufacture to the best of their abilities. So I'll kind of stop with that and welcome questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. The theme of just, I think what you're underscoring is they want certainty. They want to know what the rules are, and if they keep changing, it's so hard to plan. If we could maybe go back to the supply chain question of, what's the role of are corporations going to make their own decisions on supply chains, regardless of what the government does, or does the government really play a role in influencing these decisions? I noted over the past week in Japan's economic emergency bill that's going to be going through the Diet, they set aside money for Japanese companies to move their supply chains either back to Japan or to to Southeast Asia, I believe. And so I'd be interested in the panelists' view on that type of policy, and do you think that might gain some traction in the US and elsewhere? Also, we all know that there's this Buy America executive order, which seems to be bouncing around the White House and other agencies, which will include, provisions, for example, on government procurement. And so I'd just be interested in hearing from the panel, and maybe I'll start with Beth here. Does the government play a role here? What could it do constructively? I mean, there are probably certain sectors like medical where we have a lot of vulnerabilities. We weren't ready for this crisis, and maybe we should be doing more at home. But how can we do that in a smart way that doesn't raise prices and kind of, expose other vulnerabilities? Beth?
So I'll just start maybe by pulling us out a little bit. And even the Financial Times editorial board said we have to have a radical rethink of the way we've been doing things for the last 40 years. And I think that includes all sorts of economic policies. I think it also includes trade policy. And I think the default still is to believe that if we just let business make all the decisions, we're going to end up with good results. And as I said at the beginning, the mantra has been efficiency. And now we're seeing that efficiency is at odds with resiliency. And that's a problem we're going to have to solve. I'm not sure that without rejiggering the incentives, we're going to end up with the kind of resiliency we want if we leave it up to business. I mean, Nicole, you're talking about vertical integration. Okay, but that's just more concentration, actually, the kind of stuff that Keynes and FDR were worried about. There's a resurgence of the antitrust movement because there's concern about concentration of capital and whether that's going to produce the best results for society as a whole. So I think that's the context in which this conversation is emerging. So I think we are going to see a reversion to more government intervention. And I don't think this is actually about consumer prices because, we got a lot of dead people because we don't have enough shortages because the whole model has been oriented around consumer prices. So I think that's where the deeper rethink has to happen, where it's not just about efficiency. We've got to think about how to build a system that actually works for human beings. So I think there is a role for the government. I would distinguish between the desire to have a proliferation of supply chains, diversity in supply chains, with necessarily onshoring to a particular country. Because I think it was Annabelle who pointed out, you have a concentration risk no matter where you make it, and you want to diversify away from that concentration risk. So I think what you want to see is different countries with different abilities to ramp up manufacturing of critical goods. And Annabelle, I'd love to hear what you have to say on this, because there's a risk that in this process we leave developing countries behind who aren't going to have the same capacity to use a Defense Production Act and start creating all of these products. So we're really going to have to be thoughtful about how we make sure that developing countries are part of the solution and not left behind.
Well, thanks. Annabelle, can I move to you? Maybe you want to respond to Beth's question and then to my broader question.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. So I think we need to distinguish with what may be sort of like wartime economy, which you can argue that in a way, this is where we are now, towards more normal times. So in this case, what we need is expand capacity. And I don't think that you can simply expand capacity in one single country. Most of these products, you take respirators, we know that they need over 600 parts to be made. So what are you going to do? Are you going to bring the full supply chain of respirators into one country and think that you're going to be able to do it? No, that simply will not happen. Or, you know, if it can happen, it would be very, very expensive. So to me, it's more like what kind of policies can be put in place by governments that will facilitate the expansion of capacity. And here, you know, if I take the perspective of a developing country, for instance, policies that are favorable to investment, that provide certainty on the rules of the game. I thought what Nicole was mentioning was very, very critical for companies. Countries that commit to open trade lanes. These are countries that will see some of this investment coming in. I think of my own country, Costa Rica, where a lot of companies of the medical devices industry are established in the country. If Costa Rica were to say export bans, no medical devices go outside of Costa Rica, well, for sure, those companies would not be coming here. And I think that would apply to a number of countries. So to me, it is true that we're going to see this rebalancing that Beth was mentioning between efficiency on the one hand and resiliency. And we know that in certain industries, the efficiency part had gone, if you wish, almost to an extreme with just-in-time, for instance, mechanism in the auto industry and others. Maybe now we will see a bit more balance towards risk management and resiliency. But there's also something about visibility in the supply chain. Maybe some companies knew who their immediate suppliers were, but maybe not their tier 2, their tier 3 suppliers. So I think companies will start thinking more about this. And we will see some vertical integration, as Nicole was mentioning. We'll see some regionalization of supply chains going forward as well. I think we will see different alternatives. But in every one of these alternatives, I think what is very critical is that trade policies actually support the best decisions to be made by the firms. That I think trade policy, we need to make sure that tariffs are low, that trade can move, you know, with trade facilitation measures in place, that technical standards do not become an unsurmountable obstacle. So there's a very strong role for governments to play in basically designing the conditions for the supply chains to be able to restructure in the best way possible.
Thank you. Let me then turn to Nicole, and then we'll turn it back to Ken to take questions from the audience. Nicole, do you think any of your clients would welcome a Japan-like policy and take advantage of subsidies offered by the US government to come home?
Well, I think one of the key factors is we have to remember when a corporation is trying to make a decision as to where they're going to locate, it's not just about getting that initial incentive. So I think in some industrial areas and some products that are made, despite executive orders demanding that everything must be made in Buy America or Buy American, which we have a lot of Buy America and Buy American laws already in place, particularly for government procurement, that initial influx of money might be attractive, but there are some that will not be able to take advantage of it. Maybe it's due to their high use of the labor force. I mean, let's think about it. Before we went into this COVID pandemic, we were down at 3.6, 3.7% unemployment, right? And that's virtually full employment because a lot of the people at that point, some economists say, are just not employable in the 9 to 5, 6 days a week framework. They have to have different types of employment. So we were really at full employment. So one, you've got to consider if I've got something that is labor intensive, where I need a large workforce, coming back to the United States, despite the incentives, that's not going to be helpful to me. Additionally, I need to see whether or not I have the ability to ship my goods or get my goods where they need to be. So let's say I come back to the United States and there's an incentive program that you located in some remote state, which is has a small labor force, which does not have cheap access to electricity because, you know, let's say the Tennessee Valley Authority area has really cheap electricity, but if I'm in Alaska or if I'm in Wyoming, I don't have as cheap of access to electricity. But if the incentives say, oh, if you go in Wyoming or if you go in Tennessee, you're going to get a different rate and you've got different incentives. That's not all that's going to be, and that's not all that they're going to be looking at. So they're going to be looking at, whether or not they can get the goods where they want, whether they get the electricity prices they want, whether they've got access to a good workforce. And that applies across all countries. So it's not just looking at, in the United States. So if you've got Japan, for example, that is putting in incentives and they want you to come there. Well, again, if you're trying to look at a sustainability and a climate minimization model, you decide, you know what, let's don't put manufacturing in Japan because we're going to be shipping it back to the United States. But if your target market is the Chinese market or the ASEAN countries, then you may put some of your manufacturing in Japan to take advantage of those incentives to service that Asian market. So I think we may see more hub and spoke type manufacturing operations again, looking at maybe Western Hemisphere sourcing, maybe the African continent, European sourcing, and then the ASEAN subcontinent, Asian type of sourcing. That may be something where the companies start to go to. But the government incentives, they're nice, they're great, but there are so many other factors that have to be reviewed by companies that I don't think that those will be final determinant factors.
Well, thanks. I think what you're suggesting, we might see more kind of regionalization of supply chains. But I think you raise an excellent point that when companies make these decisions, they look at a whole array of factors. So maybe if the government's giving a subsidy, that could be the icing on the cake if all the other factors seem to suggest that this was in their interest. Again, governments can provide incentives, but they can also impose penalties or take preferences away as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it now to Ken, who's going to be entertaining questions from our large audience. Over to you, Ken.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks all of our discussants. Really interesting conversation. I want to remind people to please use the Q&A function to type out questions. If you can identify who they're directed towards, that would be a little bit helpful. One of the questions already, I think, sort of got answered about, Nicole, when you got into the hub and spoke system. I think we got into a little bit of that. One of the questions about whether companies would source closer to their markets and how they would make those decisions. But a sort of related question I'm going to come to Beth about. This comes from a good friend of a lot of ours, Ron Lorenzen. He asks about this vertical sourcing model, and do you think that if companies are moving in that direction, do you think it will work better in a free market system or a more centralized governance system? Where do you think that may actually take root?
I mean, China's already doing it. So if you look at a lot of their 5-year plans and their industrial policy planning, they're pushing for vertical integration. And so I think the trade community probably needs to be more plugged into the resurgence of the antitrust movement than it currently is. I actually think of China as fundamentally monopolistic. It's monopolistic behavior, it's anti-competitive behavior. And one of the most important chapters in the Havana Charter that really stunned me when I saw it, there's an entire chapter on restrictive business practices. And this is what I mean, that Keynes and FDR were really concerned about the concentration of capital, and they had a whole chapter to try to deal with it. So I am actually concerned that in fact, China has already been pushing vertical integration. And what you're seeing quite often with the companies that are under the most scrutiny for antitrust right now is they're saying, we have to concentrate in order to compete with China. And the neo-antitrust movement is really fighting against that precisely because of the experience we had after the Gilded Age, the Depression and so forth, that concentrations of capital are actually very dangerous. So I'm worried that state capitalism is actually contagious.
Thank you. We have a really interesting question. I'm going to come to Annabelle for this one. It comes from Jackson Wong, and I'm just going to read it off. It's a well thought out question. There seems to be a common understanding that collective response among countries is critical to tackle the pandemic crisis, but it also seems difficult or challenging to bring countries together in an international cooperation, say a WTO platform. Should we consider pursuing such agendas through a plurilateral discussion among a number of interested countries to build critical mass first, or focus on a narrow area, say pharmaceuticals or medical supplies, with a view to achieving a more desirable outcome? And I know, Wendy, is some of the things that you've also written about that have helped kickstart this whole series.
Yeah, I do think that plurilaterals are a great way to go. I believe that the WTO provides an umbrella where countries can come together. And we have seen that actually happening. I think that this joint statement that came out yesterday from a number of countries, including the US, WTO members, including the EU, Japan, Brazil, Australia, Mexico, Paraguay, Peru, Qatar, Singapore, Switzerland. And it's quite powerful in the sense that these are countries that, for example, commit not to impose agricultural export restrictions and refrain from implementing unjustified trade barriers on agriculture and agri-food products and key agricultural production inputs. This is certainly much stronger language, for instance, than what we saw coming out from the G20. You know, it's maybe in this context of group of countries coming together where they can make sure that this is open, that other countries can join. I think it's probably the way to go. In my opinion, we will see some of these things happening more and more in the context of the WTO.
Thank you. Next question we'll take is I'm going to direct towards Nicole. What do you think the impact is going to be on supply chains in the areas of transportation and logistics? Are we going to see changes in the way cargo moves by ocean if the changes that you were talking about were to take place? And is that an opportunity for the maritime and air transport sectors to adjust their models?
Right. I do think that one of the changes we are going to see are going to be in the transportation and logistics, just as I explained. And part of that is it's not just as a result of the COVID, but I think it's a result of a lot of the companies, corporations, brand names that want to try to invoke some sort of sustainability model. How can they become more sustainable? How can they minimize their carbon imprint? And I think that that's going to result in a lot of the changes. I think it's going to, I believe that they're seeing the impact, and I'm sorry, I don't recall who said maybe it was Beth talked about visibility into supply chains, which you didn't have that visibility into maybe the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 suppliers. And now you're seeing that visibility. I think that because you have that vision into where things are coming from, you start to understand what your actual global footprint is as a producer. And I think that because many of the producers are looking at who is going to be my consumer, who are the more, what is the age group that I'm looking for? And as the current younger generation starts to mature, are they going to carry with them the same emphasis that they have on in the environment and climate? And I think that there's some of the leading brands out there who are thinking, I want to be at the forefront of that. I want to get myself set up so that I imprint now on this up and coming generation that is so concerned and so activated about the climate that I'm reducing that footprint. And that's going to result in fewer ships going back and forth. It could result in increased traffic by trains. And that, of course, you know, talking about government intervention and policy and how can government intervention and corporate individual policy interact. If you are in a very large continent and you don't have the infrastructure to move goods in and out, and maybe you're in landlocked countries, you don't have an ocean that you can get things out easily, the government can intervene through putting in rails and putting in enough transportation so that they can then move the goods out of the country or move the goods around. So I think we're going to see some of the changes. And like I say, because of the conscientiousness of some of the companies, they are pushing in new developing countries, especially, to move towards rail versus building roads and putting trucks on the highway. They really want to try to minimize the carbon imprint. So I think there's going to be a change. I think we're going to see probably potentially less air freight, less ocean freight, and more goods moving by train.
Thank you, Nicole, for that. I appreciate that answer. Next, going to come back to Beth. Question from our good friend Doug Palmer. You talked about, Beth, about why eliminating tariffs on medical supplies might not be a good idea because China would have a cost advantage. Do you think that's why the Trump administration has been slow to do anything on that front? And do you expect the US to join the EU and others in negotiating a sectoral agreement to permanently eliminate medical tariffs? Beth, microphone, please.
I really don't know why the Trump administration sort of adopts various policies, so I can't really speak to that. I can say that, I think the muscle memory on trade is built around tariff elimination, and that's where I think we have to hit the pause button. I think a sectoral agreement involving the Europeans, the Japanese, the Canadians is a really good idea, but I don't think it should be focused on tariff elimination until we've figured out how we're going to be promoting diversification of supply chains. So I'm definitely in favor of working with like-minded allies to try to get there. But I think we keep starting with the premise that tariffs are the way out of it. If we accept the premise that efficiency leads to problems like shortages, then we've got to start rethinking the role of tariffs, because the reason we eliminate tariffs is to promote efficiency. So that's why I think we've got to really get our minds around the relationship between efficiency and resiliency. Yes, work with our allies, but I don't think you start with the premise that eliminating tariffs right away are going to be the solution.
Thank you for that. Getting a lot of different questions coming in, and some of them seem to overlap a bit, but I think one of them that came in from Bill Lane is, will the ongoing US-China trade dispute factored in, and I'm embellishing here a little on his question, with what's been happening with COVID, do we think that when the economies start coming back online, China is going to be likely quite a robust growth, compared to some others, as well as Germany coming back online, and both are countries at which we've had some trade disputes, or the Trump administration has had issues. Do we think that, what's that going to mean for US companies trying to get into those markets that may be some of the more faster growing ones? Annabelle, I don't know if that's something that you want to address, or maybe we could go to Nicole after that.
Yeah, let me just say before that a word that I think that tariffs on health and on health products, and also on hygiene products such as soap, which we know carries a high tariff in many countries, are really a regressive form of taxation that targets the sick. And I don't think this is like any other area. And I think these considerations should also play a role in thinking, what should tariffs be in going forward in this sector. Now, in terms of what the world will look like after COVID-19, I think it will depend very much on the type of recovery that we will see, and we know that there are many different views about this. This is going to be a V recovery in a V shape, in a U shape, in a W U shape. Is going to be more like a bathtub. So a lot of this will depend on how the global economy on the one hand, and how the different countries come back. So I think this is one part. The second part is, what role will geopolitics continue to play in going forward, and how much trade policy is going to be one of these very important tools of the geopolitical discussion. So I don't think at this point in time we can say companies will face tougher conditions in China or tougher conditions in Germany, or the opposite. It depends about on all of these factors sort of and how will they play out in the next few months.
Thank you, and kind of leads a good pivot to come back to Nicole. I probably have time for one or two more questions at most, but this one comes from Don Calvert. And is there a concern about bottlenecks when the US economy comes back online? And how do you see, what do we need to do to prepare for that? Both our ports and airports, with the limited resources that, the US government's spending a lot of resources on stimulus, but our resources are stretched thin by the federal government. There's a lot of people who are out missing work. Where do we need to prioritize, and what do we need to do to get our ports and airports back up to speed when the economy starts coming back online? We're all talking about movie theaters and restaurants, but if the goods aren't going to be able to be moving through the ports, there's not going to be a whole lot of new products coming in. So how do we manage the ramping up of the economy?
I think that's a great question, Don. One of the things that I've looked at, and I've given a couple presentations on the global economic impact of the virus, is I have some satellite images looking at the port of LALB, and it's looking at it from February of last year, and then it's looking, I'm sorry, of March of last year, and then a picture of March of this year. And if you, from above, you can see how much of the territory and how much of the space that they have set out for the cargoes, for the containers when they come in that are just sitting there, how filled it is in 2019. And then when you look at the picture from 2020, it's devastating how empty that landscape is. What that says is we've got a situation right now where we've got cargo containers in the wrong place at the wrong time. So we've got it is a bottleneck. It absolutely is. And I've kind of compared it to an inchworm. You know, some people don't know, an inchworm is a little caterpillar, has little feet here and little feet here, and the way it moves is its body goes up and out and does like this, and it comes up and straight. So it's like an inchworm. We've got a situation where we've got cargo that are blocked and they're in the wrong place. And so how do we move that efficiently? I think that's something that has not been given the attention that it needs to be given. I think the same goes for with respect to air, because there are a lot of goods that are now being shipped by air. But once, and some of the airlines have started taking their passenger planes and moving them more towards shipping cargo, making them a cargo plane. But as they do that, how do we unwind that and now move that back to cargo planes moving cargo, passenger planes moving passengers, containers being in the right cities for export and import, and how do we manage all that? I don't think anyone's looked at that. I don't think they've started thinking about getting out of this recovery. That's something that, you know, quite honestly, maybe the administration creates a task force to figure out how do we logistically begin to address all of these bottlenecks that we're going to have from other countries as they come online. I think it's going to be important too, particularly in the NAFTA or USMCA countries, because we are so intertwined in our manufacturing, not only in our automotive sector, but in many other sectors. And so I think we've got to figure out, if the United States starts to come online, but Mexico is not online, how do we make sure that we're still able to produce, recognizing that there is an absolute priority to the health of your workers, because that's your backbone. If your people aren't healthy, then you can't produce. At the same time, how can we start to release some of the constraints and shutdowns? How can we identify more essential manufacturing, and how can we try to bring that on in a coordinated manner? Again, I'm not familiar enough with the administration's efforts on trying to bring the North American manufacturing online, but I know that it's going to be impacted greatly. And I think it's even more so when we talk about goods that are being imported and exporting.
Thank you, Nicole. I think if we have that task force, I think we need to nominate you to be on it. I know we have some administration people who've been monitoring these sessions, and if they hear that, I think they should have you on. We're going a minute over, but I want to ask this. There's a question, really kind of a fundamental question that came in, and want to give this one to Beth and then turn it back to Wendy to close out our session. Beth, do you see any, you've talked about, and I'm really grateful because I'm a student of history myself, going back, and President the Creation is one of my favorite books to understand the world we live in today. You went even before that, of course, in some of your discussions. But do you see that is there any appetite for a rethink of the global trading system along the lines that you've been talking about? And this is something that, you know, I think people have been asking pre-COVID. You know, certainly, you know, we had started a partnership with Wendy and the Asia Society Policy Institute to look at WTO reform. I think, you know, and even Bob Lighthizer said if we didn't have a WTO, we'd need to create one.
Yes.
And so, you know, I just want to hear your thoughts on the prospects for this kind of reform, and maybe create an open invitation for you to come back for one of our future sessions to talk about some of that.
Thanks. I'd be happy to join anytime. I think there is, and in fact, I think in many respects, Congress is a little bit ahead of the trade establishment on thinking about this stuff. Certainly the way things have evolved in the last few years. I think I've talked to a few members who've said, you know, if they had to do it over again, they wouldn't have voted for China PNTR. That's a pretty bold statement from people who voted for in a way that facilitated the situation we have today. And I would really encourage, since this is really sort of mostly a business group, really encourage people to think about the evolving discussion about the relationship between business and government and democracy, because I think this is going to get situated in that conversation. And I find that the trade community is a little bit siloed from these larger discussions. There is absolutely emerging a conversation about the relationship between business and whether we've let it go too far and whether government really should have a more active role. And I think a discussion of the reform of the trading system, which has been designed around this laissez-faire model, I think that's going to end up being part of it. And I'm certainly always happy to talk to anybody about what that looks like.
Thank you. Thanks, Beth. And just so you know, WITA is a broad membership. We have academics, embassies, government officials,
Fair point.
lawyers, people around the world. We're not just a
Okay.
business group. We are a membership, all commerce group. Want all of you to feel welcome at WITA.
Point taken.
Well, I'm going to ask Wendy to close, but Annabelle, you had your mic off. I didn't know if you had any final words that you wanted to say.
No, I think that, this is just the beginning of a discussion that I think we will have for the future, because these are very complex topics, and they were complex already before COVID-19. COVID-19 just had made them even more challenging.
Thank you. Wendy.
Okay, so Annabelle, she just stole my my closing line. So I'm just going to just say I echo your point. And all of these issues, including where do we do with the WTO? It was so complex even before COVID, and now when you talk about when we turn the corner on COVID, where should the WTO's priorities lie, and how we should be looking at all of these issues. And I think Beth and Nicole and Annabelle, they've really raised good points and kind of has introduced the need for us to really look at these issues in just differing perspectives going forward as we all try and chart out, the direction we should be headed and what the policy responses should be. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you, Ken, over to you.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks to all our panelists. We're really grateful. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions. I will tell Robert Hollyman, who asked a question about Defense Production Act and the General Procurement Agreement. Maybe those are some issues we can get into next week. Again, we have sessions on Tuesday with Congressman Brad Schneider, and on Thursday we'll be looking at the Defense Production Act, Buy America, and maybe can get into some government procurement issues as well at that session. Thank you all. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. Please keep ideas coming our way for what we can talk about in future discussions. Thank you, Beth, Wendy, Annabelle, Nicole. Really grateful to have all of you. Everyone stay safe, be well. Thank you.